Hi, this is Dr. Cesar Oliver with another episode of the Way to College podcast. And when we last, or when you last heard from us, we met John Espinoza, and John is telling us a little bit about his journey, but there was so much more to tease out. And so I invited John to come back and continue the conversation and learn more about his journey because it felt like we were just getting started and there was still so much more to go. John, when we left you, or when we left our conversation, you told us you would apply to the Wallace Stegner Fellowship at Stanford. So you were in the Bay Area. You were also teaching, and you'd kind of hinted at some work that you were doing with undocumented students. Why don't we start there? Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, so it was around 2005 that I needed some supplemental income to support myself in the Bay Area. I was working kind of front desk reception at a nonprofit that ran homeless shelters in around the Bay Area, and I did work reception. I did data processing. At some point, I started doing grant writing, but I applied through the recommendation of a friend to the National Hispanic University, which is a very small and private university. And of course, hardly anyone had heard of it, although it had been around. It was established in 1981 by Dr. Roberto Cruz. And of course, he established this university to say reductively, to make sure that Hispanics and any minorities and women, had access to education. Again, this is 1981, a little bit different even back then in 2005, but it was still very useful. So it was small, and I was about 26 years old. I started as a faculty adjunct. I think started off with 2 classes. And this university, what's interesting about it, it's sort of like it's kind of between a big university and a community college. So oftentimes I'd have my students. They were great students. They were very sharp, but they were not ready to, say, attend a major university, or a big university, I should say. Maybe it was the experience is too overwhelming, or and that also included kind of a community college. We could have some really big campuses. They didn't want to fall through the cracks, and also some didn't maybe necessarily want a community college experience. So National Hispanic University was fully accredited, and degree granting and certificate granting. The resources were limited, but it was very good for people. And so maybe about a year or two teaching there, I'd like to say that I developed a reputation where folks had trusted me. And so when I started and I was teaching, say, freshmen or sophomores, 2 years later, they're juniors, they're seniors. And these were primarily Mexican American students. And when they got to their senior year, I'd ask them, oh, so what's next? Like, do you want to go to grad school? Let's talk. And then, they'd finally confide in me and they say, well, I can't. I'm like, what do you can't? What do you mean you can't? Si se puede. And they're like, no, professor, I can't because I don't have a social security number. And it just, I don't know. I think even back then I was still so very ignorant about undocumented children, because I know my father was undocumented, but for up to about 26 years of my life, I had never thought, I guess I always thought adults would cross and then maybe somehow later bring their children, documented or otherwise. I'd never really given it thought, but I had never given it any thought that an adult would cross, without papers and bring their baby with them. Like, it was unheard of to me. I mean, just kind of speak to if I was ignorant about it, can't imagine what everyone else was. So little by little, there was these students that I knew very well that were very just sharp, analytical thinkers, and they'd confide in me and say, yeah, me too. I don't have a social security number. And I'm like, but how do you work? How do you have this
Yeah.
job? I was like, well, how do you think? And so there were quite a group of them. And off the top of my head, I would think, I'd say things like, well, you gotta, save some money and go see a lawyer. And they'd say, yeah, we've done that. And it doesn't work. They tell us the same thing, like, you know, the way we landed here in the US, it's just not going to be possible. And I'm like, well, what about getting married? Not necessarily in a fake, sham marriage in a way, but marrying their boyfriends, girlfriends. And they're like, no, like for that to even happen, you have to like get married, like you have to get married in Mexico, in your home country. And then your citizen spouse then has to like sponsor you and whatnot. But if it doesn't work, then you're stuck, we're stuck in Mexico. And they also told me about they also told me how they would sorry, this is probably where you have to edit because I just like brain farted.
It's okay.
Oh, so they also told me how even if you got married, they'd have to go through these intense interviews to shake down if this is like a sham marriage. And so this is right around the time. I mean, I can't tell you when the Dream Act in California started, in relation to this, but I know the Dream Act was still, to me at least, a very new thing. So, we refer to them as dreamers. And I just didn't really have any answers for them. And they were at the National Hispanic University because it was a private university, so they didn't require social security numbers. But it also meant that they were not eligible for the FAFSA, was that the free application for student financial aid? I think that's what it's called. So they weren't eligible for that. So they'd have to, get scholarships, like folks and um, um, businesses from around the Bay Area. They, opened up their wallets for the scholarship fund. And that's how they paid for their tuition, or they worked for it. And it was, partial scholarships. But I guess it was kind of like one of the first times that I really felt helpless as an educator, because I always had some sort of answer, or at least someone to direct them to. But if they were interested in scholarships, I could help them with that. If they're interested in, transferring, I could kind of help them with that. But and grad school advice. But this I had zero idea as what to do. I mean, nobody does. Nobody does today.
Yeah.
I mean, there's answers, but obviously we can get into the politics of all that.
Yeah. And I think as a like one, I often share with my students, because they'll, I've been in higher ed now 22, 23 years. And my students are always surprised because they'll I spend a lot of time talking to them, and they talk about sort of that, they might comment that a professor doesn't know how to teach. And I remind them that a lot of faculty members are never trained to teach, right? If they're coming directly from grad school, where they're maybe studying writing or even a science in the STEM field, but they haven't done any teaching, and then their primary focus is to research or to write grants and things like that. And so the challenging thing, I think, for you and for a lot of educators is, one, if you're not getting that training, that's one thing, but then two, compound that with all of these sort of social factors that,
Yeah.
like, you feel like your hands are tied, and I'm struggling to kind of navigate and manage my classroom and ensure that kids are learning. Now I've got to kind of, how do I deal with this, right? Because that's their reality,
Yeah.
and that absolutely will impact whether or not they're in class and they're paying attention and they're planning towards something greater or long term. But right, that's sort of where their mind's at. So
But
I can imagine how you felt.
and you say that's where the mind is at, and that's a good transition, because the students that I worked with that had confided in me, as they approached their senior year and in their senior year, the idea that they could not legally work after getting their BA was very hard for them. It was like very psychologically tough. And that became a big part of their mental health. It really messed with them. And I think that's something a lot of people don't think about. It's sort of like you leave high school, and I'm sure you've heard stories. There are some people who graduate from high school, they're about to apply to college, and it's then that their parents say, well, not so fast, there's something we need to tell you. But college, I mean, in California, I believe as long as you graduate from a high school, you can go to a university, public university, and pay in-state tuition. So it buys them about 4 or 5 years of time. But what people don't think about is what happens after that, you know. Yeah, and in reading these graduate fellowship applications, there are DACA, what's that, a deferred action, what is it? Deferred action,
The acronym is I'm blanking on it right now.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, no, I know.
You might have to edit this part out, but I'll like listen to interviews on the radio and people are throwing acronyms. I'm like, well, what's that mean? So that's what
There's so many. There's so many today. It's tough to keep up with them. But yeah,
yeah.
no, I know exactly. Yeah, it is. It becomes psychological and I will never forget, and this was maybe probably 10, 12 years ago, where I had a student who was incredibly gifted, just really outgoing, great student. But he said he was undocumented, and he said, why am I still here? And he'd come by the office and we'd have these conversations. And he had a family member who was working on the other side of the law and, doing some illegal things. And he said, why don't I just do that? Like,
Yeah.
And know that I'm going to make some money and I can help my parents out and my family out. And so it was this constant conversation, right, about just being hopeful and trying to convince him that getting the degree would pan out and he would have more opportunities down the road, but really not knowing for sure, right? I was just trying to be hopeful, as I think a lot of educators are when they're trying to advise these students. How long? Go ahead, John.
Oh, I was gonna say, and it is good advice, because I had to face the same thing, and it's like, well, why should I finish? If there's no future ahead of this, and it's sort of like, because you don't know, you don't know what could happen. You need to be prepared. And these students, I mean, this is roughly 2008, between 2007 and 2009, and these students are also the ones who were able to benefit from DACA. And they were right at that age range where they weren't going to age out. I feel bad for the folks who maybe didn't qualify through age, but some of them I see on Facebook, and they have jobs. I don't know what their immigration status is today, but they have jobs, and it was a good call to finish the degree.
Yeah. Yeah, I think long term that's the advice that we want to give those students. You were there at the university for how long?
About 7.5 years.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
I spent the
So you got to probably, with some of these students, you got to develop some sort of long-term relationships with them. At least you're always aware of sort of what was going on with them, and right?
I did. Yeah. Yeah. And then for about one academic year, I think, was it one academic year? I don't, anyhow, I was also a retention specialist. I got kind of pulled into that when we created there was a first year experience program that was created on a grant. They hired a first year experience director, and they had recommended me to be her retention specialist, even though I was not trained at all. It was sort of on the job training. It's just that I had a rapport with the kids, and at that time, I think I was about 30, and I started, I guess, I started when I was 26. And the age difference between me at 26 and then the next faculty member was like 10 years or something. So I was the one who could, I guess, was closest in age to students.
John, here you are, you're a writer, you're a poet. Now you're an educator at this point during this phase. Now you're a retention specialist. And I'm very familiar with that. I think So my final 3 years at UTRGV, I oversaw the first year experience course,
Oh,
and I was the director of the program. And again, I think it was because I was with the program as it grew, and didn't have any formal training, but I had a good rapport with students, and I I know what you mean about, right. Oh, the students really like this guy, right? Let's I think he'd make a great retention specialist. Absolutely understand that. But here you are, you're taking on these various roles, and is your frame of mind, are you looking long term? Are you looking down the road? Do you have a family at this point? What else is going on in your life that do you shift in terms of, oh, this is work that I want to do long term? Or is it, I'm always a writer, I've always been a writer, and that's really where my heart is? Can you kind of put us in, what was your frame of mind that year that you become the retention specialist, and then move us forward?
So I become a retention specialist, and I'm there for maybe a year, maybe even less. And part of it was a little bit of burnout because I was holding down this a full-time job, and they still wanted me to teach a class in the evening. And then that comes with, I mean, going in and teaching is nothing, but it's the prepping and the grading. And so that's kind of why I had left that. But at that point, I kind of felt like I like this university. I think this university is for me. It aligns with my own values. I would like a full-time position, and I would, hint about full-time positions. But it was never available because of, you needed a line number for that, right? You needed the money, so it was never available. So I was there full-time, teaching full-time, full load, but not as a full-time status. But I would have been, there was a point where I would have been happy just being a full-time professor there. And so what happens is sort of what you just don't know how life is going to take you. I believe I'm married at that point. I'm newly married. Yes, I want to have a family, but it's still kind of in a kind of distance. Being a full-time professor would be a good thing, especially with the money and the benefits. I'm not making a lot of money as an adjunct, so that has an effect. I'm living in the most expensive place in the world in San Jose. I'm making very little, little money. So that kind of has an influence on one's decisions. Um, it, so how do I put it? So what you don't see coming is that when the recession hit in 2008, the university also took a hit. So they were struggling financially. They had the lowest tuition you can have for a private school. Like, they had to charge, that 25, 30, 20, $25,000, but they didn't. It was much less than that. And it wasn't enough to sustain itself. It relied a lot on fundraising. And so after the recession, it really took a hit. I mean, right, things are never that simple, but they really took a hit. And then one of their ideas of getting out of their financial jam is to sell the name to a for-profit educational institution. I think it was Walden. And Walden was for-profit, specialized like for online learning. And they had the idea that if we could, because National Hispanic University owned their building, so they didn't sell the building. It was just like selling the name. And so Walden thought, well, the Hispanic population is, booming. There's a lot of money to be made. This is a great investment, great business move. And so they sold the name to Walden University. And then Walden universities people from like Boston would come down then. So we had these like folks from corporate now coming down and making their changes, and they're going to do this and that. And then and it was at that point where I kind of decided I didn't come here to work for a for-profit, corporation. I've been here a very long time. A full-time position never came up. I think I'm done here. I think I'm a move on. And so I left, and I left to work full time. My wife had gotten her master's, and she was getting paid very well after she got her master's. So I was writing full time for a year, but you need two incomes in San Jose. So I decided to go back to teaching, except I went to another private, which was Santa Clara University. Um, but I guess to answer your question in one sentence, like you sort of have these plans, and then sometimes these external forces, think otherwise, right? So it's not necessarily always your choice. Sometimes someone makes that choice for you in a weird way. I mean, I guess I made the choice, but I had to choose between two values that I didn't think I was ever going to choose between.
And I appreciate you talking about that, right? I think because I think so many of us have these plans and how we love our lives to turn out and the things that we want to do and the careers that we want to pursue. But right, sometimes there are these external forces that are going to kind of impact our decision making and might delay or might even present new opportunities for us. And so I appreciate you talking about that. You continue teaching. You're teaching at Santa Clara University. How long are you at Santa Clara?
I think 2 academic years. Um, I think at that point, you know, I kind of decided that maybe teaching was not for me. And I guess not teaching, but the profession.
How
Um,
come?
I for me, it was physically, it was the grading. I spent too much time grading. I spent too much time prepping. My colleague, I mean, I teach the same class over and over. I mean, maybe not literally, but it was, the same class. And you'd think that I just would have, everything already in the can and everything done up. And part of it was that. But I just kept improving my syllabus, trying to improve syllabus, introducing new readings, and that meant more work. And then I just felt like my colleagues were just, they were experienced, as opposed to a first year, teacher. But I feel like they were coasting, and I was never coasting. And then I'd spend too much time grading because there's just this part of me that just didn't like grading folks, passing down that judgment. So I really had to prove that no, this is a B minus paper. And so I felt like I had to like really, really point out the flaws, why this is B minus paper, or C paper or an A minus, whatever. And then I'd like correct every grammatical mistake. And it just took too long, it just took me away from my life. And it was kind of a job. I just didn't want to do that. I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. And I just couldn't simplify my lesson plans. I just couldn't simplify. I was just putting in too much work. So around that time, this is 2014, and we're about to have our first baby, and everything's expensive in the Bay Area. Everything's in San Jose. So it was sort of this like, again, talk about things you never thought about, but we just decided it was best that I'd leave teaching, take a break, and raise my daughter, at least for a year. Um, and then decide to go back or whatnot. But that year flies by, you got to reapply like 6 months later. And that, you miss that because you're busy being a new parent. And then, so a year flies by, we're in year two, and then, we're going to have a second, child, a boy. And it's sort of like, well, I can't go back now. And I just kind of, I just never went back to academia. I guess I started doing the consulting or there was the genesis of the consulting work, in that time period.
And so this is 2014, 15 at this point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you still
2014.
are you still living in the Bay Area or do you all move? What?
Yeah, we're still living in the Bay Area, and we know we shouldn't live there, but
These are those external factors telling you need to move, but you're not paying attention to them.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, it is these external factors. We shouldn't be living there. We are. We like it. I mean, you can't beat the weather, you can't beat the resources.
Yeah.
But you're also, everyone's working like two jobs. Everyone has a side hustle. I was telling, I think my hairstylist that, back then we had everyone had a side hustle before side hustle was even like, a household term. Everyone had a
Yeah.
second job. And so we were living in a house, we were renting a house for like 7 years. That like flew by. Can't believe we were there for 7 years. We got 2 years after we got married, and then we our children were there, and the landlord decided to sell the house to buy another property in Oregon. And gave us a 60-day notice, extended it to 60 days. And it was rent controlled, so we were paying under market, and it's like, well, how do you go from a rent controlled you know a house to something that is now market? Like, where do we come up with that extra $1,000? This is now the year 2018, and we tried to look for something and we couldn't find anything, and we almost got roped into a housing scam because when you're desperate, you're willing to believe anything. And we didn't find anything, so we just kind of pulled that parachute cord, and decided to move to Texas. My wife is from Texas, and from the Rio Grande Valley, and I met her in San Antonio. I was familiar with San Antonio, so we decided to make San Antonio our next home.
The along the way, as you brought us through your journey, I love, because I think this is common for most of us, right? And I want to take this slight tangent because I always tell my students, and I don't know if you saw this with your students at the universities, they were so eager to grow up, right? They were so eager to find their dream job and start their lives and get married and things. But nobody tells them about sort of how difficult it is to, finding a place to live. And then, you talk about, right, a rent controlled place and market value. And, here you are potentially getting roped into a housing scheme, right? And so just all of the sort of the traps and all of the information and just sort of the things that now as an adult, you always have to be aware of. And you're constantly like, oh, what's that? What does that mean? And how, right? And so I appreciate you talking about that. You decide you're going to move to Texas. Your wife's from Texas. You're familiar with the San Antonio area. And again, as you're looking to move, what are you thinking about in terms of work?
I'm not, because when we moved, I tell people, because I was still taking care of my kids as full time. And when we moved, my daughter was 4 and my son was 3. So we still had at least 1 year for my daughter to enter kindergarten, and then another 2 years for my son to enter kindergarten. And I was kind of, would be free. But anyways, I tell people that I don't have traditional or conventional employment. It's like, like I work, but it's not conventional employment. So I knew, but yeah, at that time when we moved, I wasn't thinking of work necessarily. And again, it was supposed to be that Texas was cheaper, right? That we're supposed to be able to live on one income. And it turns out that's not necessarily true anymore, especially after the pandemic and the inflation that followed. And so what happened was that, I guess, after my kids went to school, and I was helping Sandra Cisneros, the author, with her poetry for many years. Her book, Woman Without Shame, her poetry book, Woman Without Shame, came out. And she's just so lovely, because she would tell people that I was her quote unquote poetry coach. And she would tell people, you need an editor, go see John. And through her, and I know Macarena Hernandez was a pivotal, but they would send me writers who needed some editing on their work. And I said, yeah, I have the time to do that. I have experience. And so they'd send me someone who just needed some edits, and I'd do it for pay. And it just kind of like took off from there. This was maybe now 2.5 years ago, and it kind of hasn't really stopped since. And in odd ways, it's sort of going back to teaching, because I'm grading, but it's not necessarily the kind of grading with the judgment.
Yeah.
because I'm just helping the book get better. But that's kind of the irony. But I love it. I love doing it. I love what I do. I love helping other writers kind of like help them see the book that they're looking to have,
Yeah.
that you're trying to get. So, but no, it just kind of happened organically. That's the thing. My dream job almost. I guess I could think of other cooler things that pay a lot more and do a lot less work as a dream job. But it really is a kind of I love what I'm doing, and it's a dream job, and it all happened sort of organically.
Yeah. So a couple of things, John. Thank you. The first is you had a serious name drop. You were like, oh, and so I've been Sandra Cisneros, poetry coach,
Oh yeah.
right, for years now. So one, I'm going to want to know, as I think that our listeners and our viewers are, is that one, how did that connection happen? Because I'm sure it's not like, let me drop Sandra Cisneros an email and say, hey, you need help with your poetry. Can I help you? Right? I'm sure it doesn't happen like that. So there's that question. But then the second question is, you talked about how you love the work that you're doing. And I think um sort of, and we can get into this with the final few minutes, but um we often tell people, right, follow your passion, do what gives you joy and fulfillment. And I think I don't know many young people that know what that is. And I feel like you don't know what that is until you've kind of lived a little bit and you've done different things. And so I think your story is just such a great example of that, right? Doing all of these different things, filling various roles. Along the way there, you're still writing, you're still creating. And now it's sort of like a combination of the teaching and of the creative aspect and helping others get better with their work. And so we can talk a little bit about that, but tell us about, how did you get connected with Sandra Cisneros?
Well, I'm just as surprised as you are, if that at all was a surprise. I'm just as surprised as you are. So I met I won't make this a long story, but I met Sandra when I was in my first semester at my MFA program. She had flown into Phoenix to do a reading in like Tucson, and my program coordinator had been invited to have lunch with her and her host in Tucson. They're in Tempe, and my program coordinator couldn't make it. So she said, "Why don't you go in my place?" So originally that's how I met her. So I was, freshly minted, 22 years old, first semester of my MFA program. And then I saw Sandra, she's just so generous. And she actually had offered to write a blurb for a chapbook that I was getting published, I met her in 2001. In early 2002, I was going to have a chapbook published, and she offered to write a blurb. And then in 2004, I met her again at the Macunda Writers Workshop. I saw her again, and she remembered me, and it was kind of like seeing an old friend, even though I didn't really know her very well, but it was like seeing an old friend. And then, I saw her, for a few more years after that, the Macunda Writers Workshop. And she has so many friends, she has so many fans. I just figured I was just another one of them. And so part of the surprise is that, yeah, around 2014, I think maybe it first started in 2012. When I was working, I had started working at Santa Clara, she dropped me an email and said, "Hey, I have a poem, here." She hadn't been writing poetry for a while. And she said, "I have a poem here. Would you look at it and kind of give me some feedback on it?" And I was like, "Excuse me, what?" Like, you want me to do, what? Like, me? Like,
Yeah.
why me? And I mean, I didn't tell her this. This is going through my head, and I'm like, is Richard Blanco not available? And Richard Blanco was the the presidential inauguration poet for President Obama's second inauguration. And Richard and Sandra are good friends. And I'm like, is Richard not available? Like, why? And he probably was not available. but but yeah, and so she asked me to do this, to give her feedback on a poem, and I did. and I felt very confident about the feedback that I gave. I just not very comfortable giving feedback to a MacArthur genius and the author of House of Mango Street. And I didn't hear from her after that. I thought it was kind of maybe a one and done deal. And then I want to say 2014, if my memory serves right, she asked me if I can read some or give her feedback on some poems. And then she said that part of her contract with Knopf is a book of poetry. And so she, needs to get on it. And if I'd be willing to help her as a her poetry coach. And so she'd write poems and she'd send them to me, and I'd give her feedback. And it was just kind of, talk about organic, because I didn't know what the plan. We had no plan. It was just
Yeah.
like it was me agreeing to give her feedback on poems, and that went on for 8 years. 8 years, just sometimes I didn't hear from her for a few months, and then sometimes she'd send me like 10 poems in a month. And it wasn't until the pandemic hit, everything got shut down, that it was near she had enough to complete a collection, and she just sat down and finished the rest of it. And that was 2001. And then the book came out in 2022, and next thing I knew, I had been doing this. I mean, I guess she asked me to help her finish the book like 8 years prior, and then she asked me for first time 10 years before, but I never planned that.
Yeah.
And I told no one. I didn't tell anyone. I thought it was a very private thing. I moved to San Antonio, and a friend of mine, Natalia Trevino, was like, "Hey, so I heard you're Sandra's poetry coach." I'm like, "Where did you hear that? Where did you get this from? This is secret information. Where, are you tapping my phone?" No, Sandra was telling people, and I was like keeping it a secret out of like privacy. So
Wow.
yeah, that's how that happened.
Wow. So, John, you told us, but just after that you love the work that you're doing. So it's safe to say today you are a writing consultant. If we had to give you a formal title, would that be the title? A
Yeah,
writer and a writing consultant, or?
yeah, that seems to, I could never settle on a title. That seems to be like more of a clearer one. Uh, I'll call people call me an editor. I'll call myself an editor, but that can also mean anything, you
Yeah.
know. And so yeah, I kind of go by writing consultant. It just establishes the kind of work I do and the position that I have, independent, and it has to do with the writing. Literary consultant is a fancy one. If I'm talking to fancy people.
But but this is clearly work that you love.
Yes. Yeah, I love doing it. I just I'm too obsessive. I have too much of an obsessive mind, and to like, help someone with the writing, from anything from grammar to like story structure, to kind of get it right. And then
Yeah.
and if I can't, because it becomes a puzzle too, to solve, like how can we make this book work?
Yeah.
Then I get obsessed with it. Because every puzzle has a solution, there's a solution.
20 years ago. We go back 20 years, right? So 2004. Could you have imagined you being in the position that you're in now, working
Uh,
with the folks that you're working with?
Absolutely not. In 2004, I assumed that I would have been a full-time professor at a university, full-time creative writing professor at a university, showing up to class half the time, collecting a big paycheck, not showing up to my office hours. That was a dream, man. And then still collecting, this is after 10 years, still collecting a paycheck. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's the job I want. But it turns out that that's not the way it really is,
Yes.
and then things become, I guess things kind of sometimes make that decision for you. When I was getting ready to graduate, there were plenty of creative writing post-baccalaureate fellowships that I applied to. And I didn't get any of them. And I was so surprised, because I feel like I was well accomplished in publications and everything. Like I thought I checked all the boxes. Minorities, I was a minority before, things really took off, and these places were looking to bring in more minority, writers. And yeah, I never landed anything right after grad school. And I think, I mean, who knows, right? Because the process of getting selected for something is so complicated about, things that you don't even realize, right? But I should have gotten more help. I should have gotten more help from professors writing these applications, man. You know, you just, if you've never done it, if you've never done it before, you're probably not doing it right. You know,
Mhm.
Your
Yeah.
professors, they've done it, they've written successful stuff. They know what to tell you. They know what to say in your application.
Yeah. Yeah. John, thank you again for your story and for walking us through and sharing so much of your life with us. As we wrap this up, as we conclude, any final words for our listeners out there?
Yeah, I had some final words that were said by your other guests, like, Cecilia Bayi and Macarena Hernandez, and, like, ask for help, reach out to get help. Um, Really, if you've never done it before, at your professors, your TAs, they've done it, reach out for help. There's nothing wrong with that. Everyone would be happy to help you. One that you said is that if you're looking for your calling in life, there are probably jobs, let's put, be reductive, there are probably jobs that aren't even invented yet that you're gonna be absolutely great at doing yourself. But you need to be prepared. You need critical thinking skills and you need writing skills, and both of those are easily learned. They're much easier than people think. So those were two I had until I heard you and your guest, say these things. So the more tangible final words, if you allow me, Jose, is to read an essay called "The 7-Lesson School Teacher" by John Taylor Gatto. And you can find that essay in his book called "Dumbing Us Down: The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling." And in your podcast, I've heard you and your guests talk about the hidden curriculum. Well, that's great. Yeah, the hidden curriculum. So it's by John Taylor Gatto, John Taylor with the Y, Gatto, Gatto. It's called "The 7-Lesson School Teacher." It changed my life. It changed the way I think about education, and it really motivated me to take control of my own education. And the second kind of practical word of advice is another book that I would recommend reading. It's called "Never Split the Difference: Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It" by Chris Voss, Voss. And Chris Voss formerly was the FBI's head hostage negotiator. And you got to learn how to negotiate. And I'm not talking about negotiating in like a sleazy car salesman, way with pressure, and not taking no for an answer. And Chris Voss's I guess style is essentially breaks down to being a listener and having empathy. There's more to it, but it's about listening and being empathetic. It's not about high pressure salesmanship. And you're going to have to, if you want to be successful, you're going to have to ask for things. You're going to have to ask for opportunities. And one example I can think of is Cecilia Bayi, when she said she was like, 17 and she was getting like flown into Stanford, and she called Harvard and Harvard told her no.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, the guts on her to call. I never would have done that at 17, call Harvard, even though I did call the FBI office for an application. But obviously I'm not doing Monday night quarterbacking, but you're gonna have to ask for these things, and you're gonna need to know, you need to be ready with what you're gonna say, and you're gonna have to expect that the first answer is no. And then where do you go from that no? How do you get around that? Because people's first natural conservative reaction and answer is no, because they haven't thought about it yet. So they're gonna tell you no. And so yeah, I recommend that book, "Never Split the Difference." Students should brush up on their negotiating skills. But yeah, that's it.
John, thank you. I'm gonna check both of them out. I did hear an interview with Chris Voss on a podcast. It was fascinating. There's so much wisdom there. And I'll check out the essay that you recommended because I think, like to your point, you said it changed your life and you took ownership of your education. And I often get asked about the themes that have emerged from these conversations. And I tell people a theme that I didn't count on. I expected certain things, but one theme that I didn't count on was that so many of my guests talk about this moment when they decided, okay, I need to take ownership of this.
Yeah.
And for some of them, it was like middle school, like
Yeah.
sort of absent of mom and dad, kind of in their own sort of head, like, okay, you know what? I don't like the situation and I'm going to take ownership of it. And then for others, it comes later. But that moment of deciding, like, okay, I need to take ownership is so powerful and so critical. And so thank you. Thank you. And what I'll do is if you don't mind, you feel free to send me a link to the text and I can add it in the show notes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it's good. Thank you for having me on. You know, very very flattered and enjoyed talking to you. You know, you really dried out of me.
I
So
appreciate that. Thank you. This concludes another episode of the Way to College podcast. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our listeners out there and viewers. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, follow, all of that good stuff. And do us a favor and share the podcast with one other person. We'd appreciate it. Thank you, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
goodbye.